Let's stop throwing these labels around and calling people bigots and transphobes so we can have an honest conversation about a delicate topic. I felt like I couldn't quite do my job as a sports columnist if I was restricted on a lot of these topics.
Another day, another delusional drama in the mainstream media. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, your home for independent and nonpartisan commentary and analysis on politics, media, internet insanity, and more. And we're going to check in some big media drama that's unfolding across the internet right now, being very widely discussed in political media circles, because the Seattle Times, which is obviously the most prominent newspaper in Seattle and in Washington state, is typically pretty left wing, is having a bit of a scandal right now because a sports columnist there just resigned in protest after the newspaper allegedly spiked, aka got rid of and didn't publish, a column he had in the works simply suggesting that girl athletes who were concerned or competing against biological males weren't inherently hateful or transphobic. That's it. That was the hot take. The 20 side of the 80-20 issue, a nuanced expression of concern that was apparently beyond the pale at the Seattle Times, and he decided to resign in protest. So here's the headline from Mediaite. Longtime Seattle sports columnist resigns over Spike's Sophie Cunningham article. Quote, "The mob is frightening." Here is a little bit more from this piece. Longtime Seattle sports columnist Matt Calkins announced his decision to resign from the paper after 11 years Thursday. Calkins accused the newspaper of spiking several columns of his, including one about Indiana Fever guard Sophie Cunningham. And here's his post on X that went viral, racked up more than 7 million views, announcing his departure. "After 11 years as a sports columnist at the Seattle Times, I have decided to resign. It was entirely my choice, and it was not an easy one. The impetus was the Times declining to run a column I wrote from the perspective of two female student athletes who were opposed to competing against biological males. It was one of several pieces of mine that had been spiked, and I no longer felt like I could properly do my job as a columnist. I lay out the situation in greater detail in the link below, but I want to say that I enjoyed my time with the paper, find the talent there to be immense, and have no animosity toward anyone who works there. It was just time for a change." First, I want to shout out, and I'm going to actually link to his Substack in case people want to follow along with his work as an independent writer now that he's left the Seattle Times. But I want to shout out Matt for being incredibly gracious about this, incredibly polite, incredibly respectful to his colleagues, because frankly, I would be pissed and I would be naming names and probably making a much bigger fuss about it than he did, because this is psychotic. That ostensibly, you are a sports columnist whose job it is to write about sports, and in the state of Washington and in Seattle, they've had this huge issue. They even have a ballot initiative coming up about transgender athletes in girls' sports because there are several high-profile examples in that state of biologically male athletes competing in women's and girls' sports and winning, and other athletes just having both their privacy violated in changing rooms and locker rooms, and including, I discussed this with Brandy Cruz, the Seattle-based journalist, horrific instances of alleged sexual abuse that have happened from a male athlete competing in girls' sports. It's a real live issue in Seattle, and this guy is not allowed to even express not the hottest of takes on it, but just say that people who disagree with this aren't necessarily evil bigots and don't necessarily hate trans people and humanize their perspective at all. That apparently has no place in this newspaper that's supposed to represent the dialogue and politics of the state. That's crazy. That is so indicative of what a wild, wild echo chamber it must be over there at the Seattle Times. And it's not a shock that he's also run into issues publishing other columns that express extremely mainstream opinions, but I guess in an ultra-progressive bubble are viewed as somehow beyond the pale. And this is all very relatable to me, and I will get into some of my personal experiences in these kinds of environments in a moment. But here, again from Mediaite, Calkins also offered more detail about the other columns the newspaper declined to publish. He wrote, quote, "One was a piece questioning whether players for the U.S. women's soccer team were really the victims of discrimination in their equal pay lawsuit. Another was a more general column on cancel culture in sports. And the last, written shortly after George Floyd's death, implored people to listen to state champion basketball coach Mike Bethea, a black man, urging the public not to stereotype cops. The common theme? All of these challenged prevailing newsroom narratives and likely would have triggered the outrage mob." Calkins also insisted he doesn't want to be muzzled, as he put it on his Substack. "To be honest, I'm scared shitless right now. I have no idea how the next few months or years are going to play out, but that far beats the indignity of being muzzled." I agree with that completely. I totally understand why he would want to resign. Now, sometimes, I don't know what his personal life is like, but sometimes people have families and mortgage payments, and they can't afford the risk of going independent and giving up a steady salary, and you might make no money at all at the beginning. So it's like, I am sympathetic to people in that situation. I'm not necessarily judging those who choose to stay inside these institutions, but I admire what he's done here, and I don't blame him at all. And all of these column examples are, maybe they're things you might disagree with or quibble with around the edges somehow, but it's like, give me a break. These are not hot takes. These are not extremist opinions. Even if they were, there's an argument to air those as well, but that's not even what we're asking for here. Even in a blue state like Seattle, many of the positions he's mentioning here are completely things that people still believe and are up for debate. And just because the ultra bubble of super progressive person that staffs a newspaper finds them deeply abhorrent or offensive doesn't matter if you're actually committed to the exchange of ideas, an open debate and dialogue about these things, and the mission of a newspaper like the Seattle Times. But I want to play a clip of Matt speaking on News Nation about his experience that I thought to be eminently reasonable, plot twist. And then we're going to go through some of the unhinged tweets from people who are against him or saying good riddance or somehow, still drinking the far left Kool-Aid that suggests it is bigoted or beyond the pale to believe that female sports should only be for biological females, or to even, which he wasn't even necessarily advocating in his actual column that he tried to write. He was just saying that the girls who say that aren't hate bigots. They have legit concerns. And apparently that's beyond the pale. Anyway, let's listen to him speaking with Katie Pavlich on News Nation.
Can you give us some more details on what your column was about and why you think your editors declined to publish this one and others?
Sure. I basically went out to a rally outside of Climate Pledge Arena where the Seattle Storm play, and they had a game against the Fever. And I talked to a couple of girls who were opposed to biological males competing against them in sports. One had lost to a biological male in a race when she was in 8th grade.
The thing that
Another
never happened.
refused to play a game against a biological male, a basketball game, and was taunted by her fellow students relentlessly. And I kind of wanted to get their stories in there. And so I wrote this column. I sent it to my editors Friday morning. They said, well, it's not ready for Sunday's paper yet, but we'll take a look. Then on Monday, they said, we're going to take this up to the top 2 editors in the newsroom by Wednesday. And I'm kind of going, this is becoming like an event that they're taking this long. And then on Thursday, I got the call saying, we're not going to run it. And basically the premise of my column was, you can read between the lines and probably see where I stand, but these 2 girls were basically saying, this isn't an anti-trans movement. This is just a pro-girls, pro-women's movement. And that was pretty much the premise. Like, let's stop throwing these labels around and calling people bigots and transphobes so we can have an honest conversation about a delicate topic. And Seattle Times just didn't want to run it. It's not the first time that I'd kind of gone against the grain and gotten a lot of pushback. And so I resigned on the spot. And it wasn't an emotional decision. It kind of sounds like a rage quit move if I just was talking to a random person, but it's something that I've been thinking about for a while just because I felt like I couldn't quite do my job as a sports columnist if I was restricted on a lot of these topics.
Yeah, look, I think everything he says in this bit from News Nation is extremely reasonable, incredibly straightforward, not at all problematic or offensive by any reasonable person's estimation. But the fact that it is somehow beyond the pale at a place like the Seattle Times explains how far gone a lot of these institutions are, and probably, although some of it's also just the changing of technology and media, why they're slowly going bankrupt, right? I mean, such a 20 side of an 80-20 ideology and worldview is tough to sustain a regional or significantly sized newspaper, because you have to actually represent, the 80 at least somewhat, at least in the occasional column or a rare writer. It's not as if they're even saying that they wouldn't publish more things on the opposite side, which they could do. They could have even paired this with publishing another column making the opposite argument and had like dueling perspectives. There's so many things they could have done here, short of just blocking this eminently reasonable column. But it really does give me flashbacks to my time as a campus columnist at the University of Massachusetts, where I was like center right, or trying to just do what are actually very milquetoast takes in the grand scheme of politics. But with the student newspaper, the people that ran it were these like far left whack jobs. And to them, it was all just so crazy and beyond the pale to suggest these kinds of things. And they would do the exact kind of like death by 1,000 cuts where they just use like a long drawn out process of, oh, well, we need to fact check this more. And then they try to weaponize fact checking, where it's like they label their opinion the factually true thing, and then the actual assertions or things that are being debated, they're like, no, well, we fact checked that and it's wrong. So like an example of that would be like if he were to say that, people believe biologically male transgender athletes have an advantage over biological girls competing in girls' sports, a physical advantage that doesn't go away. Well, they would like these types, and I don't know if they did this at the Seattle Times, but these types that I encountered at the campus newspaper, they do something like find one source in some sort of academic institution that says there's no difference between trans women and women athletes. And assume that is therefore gospel and fact, and that anything else is factually incorrect and can't pass fact checking. And so they will like censor your opinion indirectly through a death by 1,000 cuts approach that's like wearing the skin suit of journalistic principles. And they'll only ever apply that level of scrutiny to controversial right-wing opinions, whereas they'll just like rubber stamp left-wing slop to go out to the masses. So that's the kind of thing I imagine he's been experiencing for years, and I don't blame him at all for wanting to be free of that, though it's hard to, build up an audience as an independent writer and make a living for yourself and go out on your own. Now, he's received a huge outpouring of support, which is good, so hopefully he'll get off the ground as a result of that. But I want to go through some of the commentary that people offered in response to him. Here is the left-wing sports writer Jemele Hill. She wrote on X, "It's not the first column of his to be spiked, and while I strongly disagree with all of the columns the Times didn't run, they should have published them. Unless these columns were factually inaccurate or not meeting journalistic standards, run it and deal with the fallout. If people get pissed, so be it. Let him have to defend his shitty opinions in the public square. I totally get why he resigned." So I wanted to include this because I partially appreciate this from Jemele Hill, but I also think it's kind of insane. So it's like the journalist in her sees that this is wrong and does support him, and I do appreciate that. But then why is she labeling him as having shitty opinions? And those opinions in question is literally just girls who want sports to only be for females aren't evil bigots. So it's like, you're so close, Jemele, on this one. I usually think she's wrong about most things, but on this one, I was like, she gets it. She's right. And then it's like at the end, I'm like, and she lost me. But hey, maybe she's getting there. Maybe she's slowly waking up. Some of these other Twitter people were not. So somebody wrote, "This is very embarrassing from Matt, and the Times will be better off without his columns if these are the fear-mongering stories he says he sought out." Somebody else wrote, "Get man, you wrote thoughtless bullshit for over a decade." Another person wrote, "Good for the Seattle Times for not giving in to the trans panic and declining to run a story about a complete non-issue." So this is crazy for so many reasons, one of which is that they're saying it's like a fake panic, it's a non-issue, when there's literally a ballot initiative in the state of Washington about it. They have high-profile trans athletes in high school sports winning things, and they have even alleged sexual assault that resulted from a trans athlete participating in girls wrestling, I believe. So it's like, of all the places that you can't say this is a non-existent issue, Seattle, Washington State is like the best example of where it actually is a real live political issue. I saw someone the other day, I think it was Darlene Graham, deflect from, who's a Republican senator. She replaced the late Lindsey Graham. She's a sister. Deflect from, criticism over her foreign policy views by saying the people of South Carolina care about getting boys out of girls' sports. And it's like, wait, that's already banned in South Carolina. They've already passed laws. That's already that is actually a non-issue in the state of South Carolina for the most part. So there are instances where that could be legitimate pushback, but not in Washington State. It's like the prime example of where it is a real issue. So that was absolutely maddening. And I just can't relate at all to the perspective of somebody that thinks this whole saga is embarrassing for him, for the columnist who did nothing wrong and was eminently reasonable, but yet constantly ran into censorship and roadblocks at this newspaper. I can't relate to it at all. But hey, some people are just too far gone. I imagine most people will hear this story and lose even further trust in the Seattle Times, if they had any left, and then actually feel sympathetic towards the sports columnist here. But you guys will have to let me know what you think in the comments below. Make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. Hit the like button and do consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube to support my independent commentary. I criticize the far left and the far right, and that's not always the best business model. So I do need support from viewers like you, and we'll leave it there and be back with more real soon.